Hi everyone, good afternoon. We will be starting very shortly. If you could kindly keep your microphones on mute throughout the duration of the webinar, please. Thank you.
لا.
Good afternoon, everyone. For the benefit of those persons who just joined, we will be starting shortly in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for some other persons to join us. Thank you very much.
Okay, نتابع.
Yes. But she doesn't want to.
No, then don't.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. So we're here from Malta's Financial Intelligence Analysis Unit, which, for the benefit of any non-Malta-based listeners, is Malta's Financial Intelligence Unit and Anti-Money Laundering Supervisor. My name is Janika Pisani, and I form part of the FIAU's Guidance and Outreach team. This section within the FIAU is the section that is responsible for drafting guidance to those persons who are subject to AML CFT obligations. And through our work, we assist subject persons on how to best implement their AML CFT obligations. So the guidance and outreach section is also the section within the FIAU which is responsible for training and outreach initiatives in general. Today, I'm happy to announce that I'm joined by two of my colleagues who will be assisting in delivering today's webinar on AML CFT supervisory examinations. The first of which is Rudolf Muscat. He is a manager within the supervision section in charge of supervising the gaming, virtual financial assets and investments industries. And we are also joined by Kurt Bach, an associate within supervision, particularly in Rudolf's section. I'm also pleased to announce that we're joined by an official from the MGA, Dr. Tracy Kauki. She is a manager within the MGA's anti-money laundering section. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you that this session is being recorded and the recording will be uploaded on our website following its completion. On our website, you may also find other webinars that we have delivered in the past, which you may watch at your own convenience. We also remind you to kindly keep your microphones turned off for the duration of the webinar. And for today's session, we have allocated 30 minutes for questions and answers. So we invite you to write down any queries or questions that may arise following each speaker's presentations in the main chat. And we will answer a number of queries at the end of the session. Any unanswered queries or other AML CFT queries which may arise following the webinar, please feel free to channel these to our dedicated inboxes. Queries at fiaumalta.org or else through the contact form on the FIAU's website. So our intention in organizing this particular webinar, which we planned for today, is to inform you as remote gaming operators of the procedure of supervisory examinations, and thus for you to all familiarize yourselves with the process that takes place before, during and even after such examinations. And the idea behind this is for you to perhaps become more aware of what to expect during such examinations, and thus for you to be better prepared. Furthermore, my colleagues will also be presenting some common shortcomings that are noted during such supervisory examinations. And we share this information because we believe it can be extremely useful for you. So please do put it to good use. By understanding the common shortcomings that are present and prominent in the sector, you can review your own systems, procedures, and processes and ensure that the subject person is not also in default. And finally, we will also be providing you with some tips on best practices for a smoother supervisory examination. Now, in order to introduce today's webinar, I'd like to start off with a brief background on the FIAU supervision and risk section to better put today's topics better into context. So as you're aware, the FIAU is the national competent authority responsible for monitoring AML CFT compliance by subject persons carrying out relevant financial business or relevant activity as are gaming operators. And this to ensure subject persons comply with their AML CFT obligations as set out in Maltese legislation. Now, the section within the FIAU that is entrusted with this function is the Supervision and Risk section, of which Rudolf and Kurt both form part of. In July of last year, the Supervision section was further segregated into 3 distinct teams, which are the team focusing on supervising credit and financial institutions, the team supervising the NFPPs, and that supervising investments, VFAs, and gaming supervision, of which, as mentioned, my colleagues form part of. The FIAU took this decision to create specialized teams within the supervision purposely to allow for better supervision across all the sectors and to increase sectorial knowledge and also expertise within the teams. It is also worth noting that despite the difficulties and hurdles that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought along with it, the FIAU hasn't stopped its supervisory examinations, but in fact, we have shifted such examinations from on-site to off-site examinations. So we had to adapt to the times and proceed with our work in another manner. Now, another point that I'd like to make, and I'll be closing with this, is that in terms of Article 26 of Article 5 of the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, the MGA is an agent of the FIAU, since the MGA also assists the FIAU in monitoring compliance by subject persons by conducting supervisory examinations on the FIAU's behalf and in conjunction with the FIAU. So that's all from my end. I'll now hand you over to Rudolf, who will be explaining the supervisory process. Thank you very much.
Just allow us a couple of seconds, please. We're just trying to set up. Thank you.
Thank you, Janica. And thank you everyone for taking the time for joining us today. As Janica was saying, first of all, my name is Rudolf Muscat. I am a supervisory manager within the investments, VFAs, and gaming team. As Janica was saying, today we'll be going through a number of topics. Essentially, while the supervisory process is more of a procedural part of this presentation, we'll try to make it as practical as possible. And we will attempt to, as much as possible, address questions that you might have in relation to the process. Next slide. Okay, starting off from the FIAU supervisory powers, just to get this out of the way, these stem from Article 26 of the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, which basically states that the unit shall be responsible to ensure that the subject persons comply with the provisions of this Act and any regulations made thereunder, insofar as these are applicable to them. Can move to the next slide. Hopefully today we will be managing to address some questions or concerns within this webinar. Mainly, why was our company picked up for a supervisory examination? Will the FIAU or the MGA be conducting the AML CFT supervisory examination? Can it be conducted jointly? Should we expect such examination to be carried out on a regular basis? What are the AML CFT weaknesses in the remote gaming sector? And how can we prepare for an upcoming examination? So hopefully these might be the areas that you might be interested in getting more information about, and hopefully we'll do our best to tackle throughout this webinar. We'll start off with the risk-based supervisory approach. Basically, in practice, we try to practice what we preach. And in the same way that we emphasize with you operators on the weight that we give to the operator's obligation in relation to the BRA and the CRA, so we do assess our operators, the subject persons that we are responsible for. And based on this risk assessment, we finally will set the frequency and the intensity of our supervisory process. But how do we risk assess? I'm sure you've heard of the REQ and CASPAR. Well, the REQ is not the only determinant, and that's just the starting point. You should know that we have close relationship with the regulators as well, so there is also an input from the prudential part. But we also take stock of other factors, a few of which are NRA, the SNRA, and we also take stock of any examinations that we have that were conducted by us or by the MGA on our behalf. So in essence, the supervisory process, the risk process from our side is quite vast in that sense. I think we can move to the next slide. Now, back to the REQ. In essence, as you know, it's a self-declaration. It's the result of which will help us to weigh risk versus implemented controls. So the output, the outcome of your questions and answers that you have put through the REQ will finally give us an idea of the risks that you are facing and also the controls that you have implemented. Here, I just wanted to highlight the importance of properly representing your situation, as misrepresentation or non-submission may potentially attract administrative action. So that's mostly in regards to the first block purpose that we see up there. In relation to how is the REQ submitted, there is the step of registering on CASPAR and submitting the REQ by the stipulated deadline. And the consequences of non-submission, we've mentioned already, basically subject person will be, might find himself under increased risk, and there will be higher frequency when it comes to supervision. So basically, it is to your own benefit that you are submitting the REQ regularly and in a timely fashion as well. I think we can move to the next slide. Now here we're trying to, I'm moving as swiftly as possible because we have quite a number of slides that we'd like to get through to you, and we'd like to stick to the time as much as possible. But obviously, as Yannicka said, we have the Q&A session at the end. Here we're looking at the supervisory methods. In essence, I think we can pinpoint them to two main mediums, being the examination itself or else a supervisory meeting. The black box is mostly in regards to supervisory meetings, as you can see, and the other three relate mostly to actual compliance examinations or supervisory examinations. The first box is telling us that basically we can conduct an examination which is either on-site or off-site. At this time, obviously, given the COVID situation, we have mostly switched to off-site. But however, within our regular ongoing supervision, we are obviously using both of them. On-site and off-site, I think it's clear to everyone. It doesn't change the shape of the examination. One is conducted remotely, the other is conducted on-site. Now, when it comes to what scope a particular examination might have, we move down to the box of full scope, targeted, or thematic. In essence, when we say full scope, it would be an examination that would tackle all the obligations that a subject person has in relation to the PML, FTR, and the IPs. Targeted and thematic are very similar in the sense that the scope will be restricted to specific areas. Thematic might attempt to take a flavor from weaknesses in the sector and try to address those areas specifically so that we have a picture that is stemming across a whole sector, while targeted is again limited in scope, but it's looking at a specific entity in isolation, we can say. The ad hoc visits I think this is quite clear. Basically, we can turn up at your door without any pre-advice and start an examination there and then. I think we can move to the next slide. All right. Here we've spoken about supervisory examination, so I won't delve too much into this. I just wanted to take the opportunity to just clarify, because you might find cases where you receive a notification letter that is coming out from the FIU, and then the MGA come over and they're conducting the examination themselves. In essence, the supervisory process does not change. So whether it is us or the MGA's AML unit, as long as the theme of the examination is obviously AML CFT, it does not change. The only difference is that it might be conducted by the MGA officers instead of FIU officers, and that the report will be issued with an MGA letterhead. However, the initial phase where we are risk assessing our subject persons, our operators, is totally initiated by the FIU risk assessment. It's the same for everyone and does not change. And finally, as well, the final processes and after the report that we will go through now and throughout this presentation, the representations and the report will appear in front of the FIU's compliance monitoring committee. So in essence, when MGA turn up on behalf of FIU, it is because they are acting as our agent in that specific examination. Again, supervisory meetings, we've spoken a bit about it in the earlier slides. Basically, these are held between the subject person and the FIU in order for the FIU to understand the procedures to which AML CFT obligations as per the PML FTR and the implemented procedures are being fulfilled by the subject person. The purpose is to engage with the industry players, and also to ensure that the risk rating that we have come up with in our risk assessment process makes sense, and also to understand the level and quality of controls implemented by the subject person, and to guide the subject person in carrying out improvements to address the gaps were identified. And this might finally be followed up by a compliance examination. So yes, I think this is clear. Usually it might just take the shape that we're discussing your policies and procedures and you're telling us basically what your controls in place are. Occasionally we might even take the opportunity to ask you to have a quick look at the system to run us through what you have just described. I think we can move to the next slide. Another one. Yes. Okay, so this is the first step of the supervisory examination. It is the step where you will receive the notification letter. The subject person is usually given 3 weeks notice that we will be conducting an examination. The first week is usually what you have in terms of submitting the documentation that we are requesting within the notification letter itself. And the notification letter is sent as an official letter through your normal mail, but it is also sent via email in advance and on the same day. What I'd like just to specify about this slide is that although we're pinpointing 3 weeks in advance, obviously in case of other examination, this does not apply. And there might also be shorter time frames if the visit is less intense.
This is an FIAU meeting. Online with the snip.
I think we can move to the next slide. Mela, this slide is lining up the documentation that we're usually requesting when it comes to the on-site examination. So this is part of the list that we send in the notification letter. Basically, as you can see, you have business risk assessment, customer risk assessment, any AML governance procedures and policies, any customer onboarding forms and templates, training log and material, list of players with specific details, unusual and suspicious transaction monitoring procedures, screening procedures against PEP lists and EU sanction lists, and internal controls and procedures to ensure full compliance with sanction screening obligations. We can move to the next slide. Okay, so the slide is basically showing us the main and most relevant stages of the supervisory examination. As you can see, in essence, we kick off with the meeting with the MLRO. So on the date that has been advised within the notification letter, there will be this kick-off meeting. The meeting is meant to be with the MLRO, and the aim is to speak to the MLRO so that he can run us through the systems and the company background, etc. Said that, we do occasionally get requests to include additional people, and in such cases it would be good practice to advise us beforehand, but it has to be made clear that we still expect to hear the bulk of the replies coming out from the MLRO. Typically, once the kickoff meeting is done, we would ask to have a system walkthrough to get an idea of what the systems will look like prior to embarking on the player profile review. And whilst we move into the profile review, then we'd ask for specific player profiles and view what is available in some detail. Finally, there would be the wrap-up meeting with the MLRO, but we can talk in more details about the wrap-up meeting in the following slides. We can move slide. Kickoff meeting we've just mentioned. It introduces the compliance review team, explains the purpose of the compliance, allows the subject person to provide an explanation of the business, client profile, etc. And it also allows the compliance team to raise questions in relation to the documentation that was submitted by the subject person prior to the kickoff meeting. When it comes to the system and profile review, as we said, the system review is mainly conducted through interviews with the subject person, key personnel, and review of documentation and system walkthroughs. I would say that we rely quite heavily on system walkthroughs. The FIU allows the system review allows the FIU to determine whether the design of internal controls applied by the subject person are adequate towards ensuring the AML CFT obligations. And finally, the player profile review involves a selection of a sample of player profiles. So at a stage after the system review, we will be requesting a number of player profiles to check, to test the details that we had spoken of, one, your documentation, and two, during the kickoff meeting. A review of the player profile will be done to determine whether the AML CFT obligations and procedures are being applied in practice, and this will allow the FIU to reach a conclusion on the operating effectiveness of the subject person's controls. Sorry for that. We come back to the wrap-up meeting. Once the system review and file review is concluded, a wrap-up meeting is held between the compliance review team and the subject person. The main purpose of this meeting is for the subject person to be notified of the main preliminary AML CFT shortcomings. It is quite important to know that the wrap-up meeting, in actual fact, it also marks the closure of the examination. We view the supervisory examination as having a lifetime. So we start off with the kickoff meeting, and once the wrap-up is concluded, in our processes, in our minds, it would conclude the first part of the examination, let's call it that. And it will also conclude the interaction with yourselves as the operators, subject person, call it what you may. So at that stage, one would understand that in between the period of the kickoff and the wrap-up, it would be there that you as subject persons would have the obligation to show your compliance to AML CFT obligations. So it is very important that we cannot keep after once the examination is concluded, the evidence is collected within that stage, and it should be there that you have put in anything to prove your compliance. Then we have a small warning sign there, and we're highlighting that the shortcomings highlighted during the meeting may not be exhaustive, as further off-site checks may be carried out by the supervisory review team after the wrap-up meeting. So in essence, what we're saying here is that at this stage of the wrap-up, our consolidation of data and understanding of any weaknesses that there might be is not complete. So during the wrap-up, we are just giving our preliminary findings. They might eventually, at the stage of the report, be more or be less. So you have to keep that in mind, please, as well. We can move to the next slide. The stage after the wrap-up meeting is the compliance examination report. So finally, the final part of the supervisory examination, at least from the unit of supervision, will be the compliance examination report. The report usually would be expected around 4 months after the closure of the wrap-up. The report is structured into a way that will initially show you the specific regulatory obligations, and it will go on to identify any potential weaknesses that we might have identified. It is important to note that you will have 30 days to submit any representational or additional evidence of improvements since the date of examination. So after the report, you will have an additional 30 days in which you will have time to react to the report, bring forward any further evidence that you think is good to put forward at that stage, or else you might have situations where you have already spotted some weaknesses and you use the months while you were waiting for the report to already start resolving these issues. And if that was the case, it would be of benefit to you to also indicate in your feedback into the representations. We can move to the representations to the report. Basically, the subject person must submit written representations, as we said, within 30 days. The purpose of the representation is twofold. It provides the SP with the opportunity to represent himself in relation to the AML CFT shortcomings. And it also allows the FIU's Compliance Monitoring Committee to assess whether the findings outlined by the Compliance Review Team constitutes a breach in terms of the PML, FTR, and the IPs. Yes, again, it is very important, and it's in your interest that where applicable, it is advisable to substantiate representation with supporting documentation or evidence. I would say that this would mark the role of supervision. So once the report has been done and the representations have been received, it would essentially close the part of the examination in relation to the supervision unit. After that, it would be moving to the enforcement unit. As you're seeing here, the next step after the report and then the representation will be of the enforcement unit preparing the case for the Compliance Monitoring Committee. We commonly refer to it as the CMC. I'm trying to emphasize here that there is a segregation between the people who have conducted the examination, that is the supervisory unit, and the people that will decide on whether or not there have been specific breaches during that examination. So both roles are segregated, and it's important that that is noted. We can move to the next slide. Here, I will try to give you a bit of a short overview of what might be the outcome from CMC. As I said, I am from the supervision unit, but here I will give you a high-level idea of what the outcomes might be. Now, should the CMC reach a conclusion that findings included in the compliance report constituted a breach, the CMC might decide to impose administrative measures, and these might take the shape of what you're seeing in those bullet points right there. Basically, it might be written reprimands, it might be corrective action plans and remediation directive, it might be administrative penalties in the form of pecuniary fines, or it also might be other administrative measures such as recommendations, notifications to other supervisory bodies or key personnel of the subject person, and directive to terminate specific business relationships. It might also be the case that where there are no breaches identified, the CMC might decide to issue a closure letter and stop the process at that. In the next slide, what we're trying to do is to give you a bit of an idea of what factors are taken into consideration when it comes to the CMC. Basically, you can see 5 factors there. There are 5 factors which are noted for each examination and which the CMC will already start taking consideration of even before getting to the actual findings or potential breaches. The CMC is valuing overall regard to AML CFT obligations shown by the SP. It values cooperation shown by the SP throughout the compliance examination. It values remedial actions taken, planned to be taken by the SP to address the AML CFT shortcomings. It also values and takes consideration of the impact of AML CFT of that particular breach on the jurisdiction. So how exposed the jurisdiction was in relation to a particular breach or weakness within the operator or the subject person. The CMC will also take stock of whether or not that particular breach has ended up in facilitating money laundering or financing of terrorism by the SP. So those are, I would say, the main 5 areas that the CMC would start off with before starting to go through the actual findings and the breaches. I think we can move to the next slide. Yes, here we're getting down to numbers. The value of penalties that may be imposed range between 1,000 to 46,500 per breach. In cases where a breach is minor and the circumstances so warrant, the CMC may impose a penalty below the minimum penalty of 1,000, but no less than 250. In cases where the breach is repeated, serious or systematic, or a combination thereof, the CMC may decide to impose the higher maximum penalty envisaged under Regulation 21(4)B of the PML-FTR. And this would be for subject persons carrying out relevant activity, that I think would be the case for the bulk of you, a maximum penalty of 1 million or another sum which shall not exceed twice the amount of the benefit derived from the contravention, where the benefit derived can be quantified. In cases where the subject persons are carrying out relevant financial business, this penalty may go up to 5 million. Yes, we've spoken about seriousness, whether the breach is systematic and repetitiveness. So those are, again, 3 very important factors when the CMC will be weighing in on the weaknesses or the potential breaches that would have been raised in the report. Seriousness is clearly understood. I mean, it would take into consideration the nature of the AML CFT requirement that has been breached and the impact of the breach due to the size of the subject person and the sector in particular. When a breach is systematic, breaches which result or are indicative of a structural issue, usually this can come out of your policies and procedures or else in the sample tested. And when a breach is repeated. So basically, if we have already come and conducted an examination on the a particular operator, and we come again after a couple of years and the issue is still there and has been tackled, this will be taken consideration of at the level of the CMC and will weigh in further on the administrative penalty that the CMC will come up with. Once the process of the CMC determination is concluded, enforcement will be issuing an official letter which will be stipulating the AML CFT shortcomings identified in the compliance report, the enforcement decision that was taken by the CMC, that is a description of the administrative measure to be applied, whether evidence of any remedial action taken by the subject persons to be submitted, and also indicate timeframes within which the subject person is expected to take remedial action to address the AML shortcomings. The case will then be delegated to the enforcement and follow-up team with the enforcement section to follow up accordingly. This brings me to the end of the part where I will be talking about the processes. We'll come now to a part which is a bit more practical and on the ground, and I pass on to Kurt, who will highlight some of the main findings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rudolf. That was very informative, very explanatory. Now, Kurt will be explaining, as Rudolf said, the FIU supervisory examinations based on the common findings that the supervisory team comes across whilst conducting such examinations. Over to you, Kurt.
So, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? All right. So, good afternoon, and once again, thank you all for joining here today. As part of my segment, we shall be going over the main shortcomings we observe and come across throughout the compliance examinations which we are carrying out. Hopefully, these shortcomings could shed some light on the practical implementations of certain aspects of your regulatory obligations. The manner in which we'll be addressing these shortcomings would be to first understand the shortcomings on the application of the risk-based approach, both in terms of the business and at customer level, the purpose and intended nature, ongoing monitoring, due diligence with respect to politically exposed persons, and the position of the MLRO. So if we can switch slides, please. So first and foremost, we'll start with the business risk assessment. As outlined in the provisions of Regulation 5.1, subject persons should carry out an assessment and analysis of your MLFT risks by assessing the threats and vulnerabilities to which you are exposed to. In doing so, you must consult with the main risk pillars, mainly relating to the customers and one moment, please. All right, can you hear me well now? All right, sorry about that. So, as I was saying, as part of your obligations for carrying out the business risk assessment, you must consult with the main 4 risk factors. First of all, being the customer risk. Where you will be understanding the type of customer that you are servicing or intend to service in terms of your risk assessment, risk appetite, the geographical area in terms of the areas which your business reaches geographically, the product offered, mainly, as you may appreciate, different products bear different risk elements, and the delivery channel risk, which for a remote gaming operator is mainly the non-face-to-face relationship, which inherently carries elevated risk. Furthermore, you should also consult with the results of the national and the supranational risk assessment, and also consult with the business structures. Now, when I say consulting with the business structures, in order to compile a business risk assessment, you must take stock of the customer portfolio that you are servicing, the type of products that you are offering to the market, and also taking into consideration other factors such as expansion plans which the company might have. Now we have set the scene as to the obligations in terms of the business risk assessment, and we shall move on to the main shortcomings in this regard. Mainly, although this finding is not as common as it was in the past, we still come across instances where unfortunately operators, subject persons, fail to compile a business risk assessment. Or else the business risk assessment that they make available throughout the review is so poorly drafted that it raises questions as to whether or not this is effective or not, and obviously would be of concern to us whether or not the risk-based approach is being applied in practice. Furthermore, we notice that the BRA does not incorporate quantitative elements. So as I just highlighted now, you should consult with your business structures. Be it part of the BRA or as ancillary documentation, you must make reference to your analysis, to your assessment, and explain where did the results of the BRA come about in terms of the likelihood, the impact, and so on. Also, we see that the delivery channel risk is sometimes neglected and not taken into consideration. May I remind you that prior to the current setting of the regulation, non-face-to-face business relationships were deemed to be of a high-risk nature. Although the subject persons today are allowed to gauge the risks to which they are exposed to, you should nonetheless incorporate this as part of your key pillars within the business risk assessment. Also, we notice at times that the BRAs incorporate areas or key pillars, risk factors, which are not AML CFT related. These could include, for example, responsible gaming and also security. I mean, from our end, if a business undertakes an analysis to understand the various aspects to which it is exposed in order to protect itself and also ultimately its customers, as a FIU, we are expecting to find business risk assessment of AML and CFT. Next slide, please. All right. Moving on, now we shall be looking at the appropriate documentation and the revision and approval of the BRA. So, in line with regulations 5.3 and 5.4, subject persons such as yourselves must properly document the business risk assessment, and including both in terms of the methodology and the application as to how results came about. Also, you must periodically revise this BRA. Specifically within the implementing procedures, there are key instances where the BRA should be revised. This includes where new threats and vulnerabilities are identified, where there are changes in the business model of the company, or there are other changes in the external factors surrounding the operations of. Nonetheless, if none of these points take place, you must still assess whether or not the BRA, which is in place, remains valid and applicable. This would still entail a minimum of an annual review. Should no other factor aside from the ones that I mentioned earlier take place, you must document and take note of the fact that the BRA remains valid as of the time of review. Now, the key shortcomings in this regard would be that the BRA does not adequately define what is the likelihood, what is the impact, and what is the effectiveness. Generally, what we would be looking at here is to see some documented rationale in terms of a matrix as to how the scales interact with the results of the BRA. In the absence of this, of course, it will be extremely difficult both for us as officials conducting the examination and the MLRO in order to help us understand the logic and rationale behind the results of the BRA. On a similar note to this, we feel that sometimes we come across risks which are somewhat broad and generic. If we keep these risks broad and generic, it might be an indication that the company, that throughout this assessment, you have not duly identified the threats and vulnerabilities to which you are exposed to. So please bear in mind that we understand that there might be some generic terms. Nonetheless, you should pinpoint the areas in which key risks emanate from. All right. All right. So let's switch off the camera because we understand that there are some sound issues. Hopefully, like this, it will be better. So where were we? Yes, sometimes we also notice that the business risk assessment and the results of the BRA are somewhat conflicting with the procedures that are being implemented in practice. Where on one end we would see that a result would yield a high risk result, but then its treatment, the control measures, and the application thereafter would be similar to those of a low risk customer or risk factor. Lastly, it is empirical that the business risk assessment and any revisions made thereafter are also approved by either the board or else a senior an equivalent managing body. We come across instances where unfortunately this acceptance, this resolution is not documented, and we are given responses such as we have verbally approved of the BRA. As you may appreciate, this is not sufficient. So we can now move on to the jurisdictional risk assessment. As you may understand, and as we mentioned earlier, different jurisdictions might bear different AML FT risks, especially when it comes to high risk and non-reputable jurisdictions. So as subject persons, you must take stock of the jurisdictions which your company is reaching in terms of the whereabouts of the customers and the whereabouts of the customers and also the reach of the company. But aside from identifying these jurisdictions, you must also perform an analysis, an assessment to understand what risk is coming out of these jurisdictions. So the major shortcomings that we come across in this regard are related to subject persons not clearly defining what is an unreputable jurisdiction, what is a high-risk jurisdiction. There's also the failure to identify which jurisdictions the company is engaging with. Again, this ties in with the initial point we made, that you must consult with your business structures and how important this assessment is. Also, sometimes the jurisdictional risk assessments that we are presented fall short because subject persons present us with lists which are extracted from either the FATF, EU list, and other sources such as Know Your Country, which in terms of identifying the high risk jurisdictions would partially help you to understand that, but the analysis part would be missing. So it is not sufficient for you to simply identify which jurisdictions pose a higher risk versus others, but it is also important for you to carry out an assessment in this respect. And the questions that you must ask is how are the jurisdictions which I am servicing can expose me to an enhanced ML FT risk, and what controls can I have in place in order to mitigate such risks. Next slide, please. So now we are going to discuss on the control measures. So aside from identifying the risks and determining their impact level, the inherent risk and the inherent risk, you must also apply control measures commensurate to the risk which have been identified. At times, we come across situations where the risks that are, where the control measures which are being listed in the BRA are either too broad or non-specific. And we are not expecting that the control measures defined in the BRA should mirror in some way the process to the letter. Nonetheless, the broadness might be an indicator that you have not well defined the control measure in place. By way of an example, in terms of dealing with relationships with politically exposed persons or as high net worth individuals, it is sometimes the case that we come across controls stating that CDD would be applied. Now, one must appreciate that due diligence measures would need to be applied in their case, however, the extent of it would vary. So the application of enhanced due diligence measures and what type of measures should be applied should be included as well as a control measure. Also, we notice that some of the control measures that are included in the BRA are not applied in practice. It seems that effort is being made in order to define a control measure at a procedural level. Nonetheless, when it comes to us reviewing either the procedures, the due diligence procedures and the customer files, we do not come across the application of these control measures, and that of course would raise concerns as to the manner in which the subject person is applying the risk-based approach and why there is a divergence between what is indicated at procedural level and being applied. So next slide, please. So now we shall be shifting our discussion on the customer acceptance policy and the customer risk assessment. All right. So first and foremost, the customer risk assessment should be duly documented, and the methodology should also be sufficiently clear in order to understand the mechanisms behind the risk rating of the customers. Now, subject persons should keep in mind that although they are not bound by a single methodology as to how to carry out the customer risk assessment, you should still ensure that any methodology which is applied is well understood and is applicable to the business which is being undertaken. The main findings that we come across in this regard are that, first of all, there is no customer acceptance policy presented. And when we say customer acceptance policy, you will not refer to a standalone document named customer acceptance policy. Even provisions which are expected to feature as part of the customer acceptance policy are not featuring elsewhere within the documentation provided by the subject person. So like this, the risk appetite remains undefined, which is, as you may appreciate, is key for the risk-based approach as well. There are also instances where the risk categories are conflicting with the result. Can you hear me? All right. Apologies for the sound issue. I hope we can progress. So the customer risk. All right. It seems that we were cut off for a moment, but we should be okay now. All right. So the customer risk assessment. Yes, sometimes there are either conflicting observations with respect to the BRA. And also, there is lack of clarity in terms of the methodology adopted. Again, similar to the business risk assessment, if you would include a risk matrix where you would define the risk assigned to certain scenarios, it would be helpful both for us to help us understand the rationale behind the assessment and also allow you to apply a consistent approach to the handling of your business relationships. Next slide, please. All right, so the purpose and the timing of the CRA. So as indicated in section 2.2.2 of the IP's part 2, the customer risk assessment should be carried out either prior to the carrying out of an occasion transaction or in case of a business relationship, not later than 30 days from when the 2K threshold is reached. Now, bear in mind that it is, although it's very important for you to have this trigger in place, the methodology of your CRA should also incorporate features that it would allow it to be revised during the course of the business relationship, as player circumstances might change and your understanding of the player will also change during the course of this relationship. The main shortcomings that we come across on this topic are that unfortunately there are instances where the CRA is being carried out late, sometimes weeks and also months after the OK threshold is being reached. And during this period where the customer is not risk assessed, gameplay may keep on going and no restrictions are applied to the player's account. So this would be of a major concern to us, because it means that the player is availing of the services of the company whilst they are not duly risk assessed. Sometimes we are presented with risk classifications of low, medium, and high. However, we are unable to understand the logic behind this because there is either no documented matrix or there isn't a rationale explained for such risk classifications. Sometimes as well, we notice that although a player is risk rated in a particular manner, the CDD measures applied are not commensurate to the risk. So there have been instances of players that have been rated as high risk. However, the CDD measures applied, which should be a result of the risk classifications of the result of the CRA, have been subject to CDD, which should have normally been applied to low risk relationships. Also, to close off on this part, we notice that the initial risk assessment is undertaken at the 2K threshold. However, no further risk assessments are taking place. Despite officials also noticing instances where the player has either experienced a change in characteristic, a change in circumstance, or also transacted in a manner which is not in line with the risk profile at the time. So these should all feature as triggers for you to revise the risk assessment for your clients. Yes, we have another point on the weighting of the risks. So sometimes we come across CRA methodologies where a collection of risks is taken into consideration for the players, and they end up being averaged out. Now, you must appreciate that even in the implementing procedures, subject persons should pay due consideration to the weighting of the risks posed by your customers, because certain characteristics may have more significance than others, and if you simply average out the risks which a customer is demonstrating, you might miss out on certain characteristics which are of a higher risk nature than others. Next slide, please. All right. So now we will be addressing the risk factors that should be taken into consideration when risk rating the customers. So basically, we all know the four minimum risk pillars, which relate to the characteristics of the products which the customer is availing of, the characteristics of the customers themselves, transactions undertaken in terms of the behavioral aspect, the interface, and also the geographical whereabouts of the customers. Unfortunately, we notice that not all these main risk pillars are taken into consideration, especially the one in relation to the interface risk. May I remind you that your business relationships are set up on a non-face-to-face setting, which inherently carries an elevated risk. So you must be geared up appropriately to handle such relationships. Also, we notice that when scrutinizing the customer risk assessment, we notice that at times we are presented with a risk classification. So, for example, we'll be presented with customer risk, and you will be awarding them a number. Customer risk equals 4, for example. Despite being able to demonstrate that a risk assessment was carried out in terms of a figure, a result, when questioning what led to this result, we struggle to obtain an understanding, and this leads us to suspect that the risk assessment and the mechanism behind it is not duly taking into consideration the features and the characteristics of the customer. In terms of the geographical risk, we also notice that subject persons tend to focus on the nationality and the residence of the customers, which in itself is a significant factor to consider. Nonetheless, it seems that no consideration is made to the geographical whereabouts from where the wealth of the customer is being generated. As you may appreciate, in today's world, it's not necessarily the case that if someone is resident in one country, they're obtaining their wealth from that same country. So due attention must be given to that as well. The same applies for the payment method risk, as this is especially relevant when it comes to customers who have more than one payment method. Especially when it comes to prepaid payment methods, it seems that not all are being factored into the risk classification. And in terms of reputation and adverse media, these are as well not always taken into consideration in the residual risk, in the risk classification of the customer. Next slide, please. So now we shall be moving on to the purpose and intended nature of the business relationship. And I feel we can start off by making reference to the provisions of Section 3.2 of the IP's Part 2, which I feel capture exactly the objective of performing the purpose and intended nature analysis part, which would be to establish an effective customer risk profile, which would serve as a key indicator to detect unusual activity during the course of the business relationship. Furthermore, in order to comply with this obligation, you must undertake an analysis of this customer, or by either through open source checks, or else through going directly to the customer obtain information on their occupation or their source of wealth. So like this, you are able to gauge also their level of affordability and what should you expect from the business relationship with that customer. Next slide, please. So the key shortcomings, unfortunately, we notice that at times the procedures are somewhat silent in terms of the purpose and intended nature. It doesn't mean that there isn't an ongoing monitoring protocol, or provisions for source of wealth, source of funds in terms of a CDD aspect, but the application of the purpose and intended nature and the way this links with the remainder of your AML CFT protocol is somewhat lacking. I think what I want to get out of this point as well is that although we just mentioned now that there are instances where open source checks are sufficient, there are also other instances where they are not. And when they are not is namely instances where the client is exposing you to a high risk. And you should not limit yourselves to open source checks, but please go directly to the client to obtain supporting documentation. Also, another shortcoming is the anticipated level of activity. Unfortunately, there seems to be a lack of understanding in this regard. As subject persons, you should take the opportunity to develop this risk profile and also develop an understanding of what should you expect out of this business relationship. And it is not sufficient for you to tell us, I am expecting low, medium, or high activity. Similar to the customer risk assessment, you should show us justifications as to how did you arrive to this result, because it will help us understand and also gauge the manner in which you are applying your risk-based approach. Sometimes as well, when it comes to obtaining source of wealth documentation, we notice that right after being obtained, we immediately develop an opinion or develop an understanding that the information portrayed on the documentation obtained does not match with the activity which is undertaken by the player. So like this, it gives us an indication that the documentation obtained adds no value to your analysis. So that would be of concern. How come did this flag another alert? And so on. So please be mindful that the documentation you obtained is adequately corroborated. Next slide, please. The next area is that of ongoing monitoring. So ongoing monitoring should be applied on all business relationships. Nonetheless, the extent of ongoing monitoring will, of course, as well vary depending on the risk of the customer. In terms of performing ongoing monitoring, we should mainly scrutinize the transactions and assess whether or not these are in fact in line with the risk profile that you have developed about the player. So here we're seeing another important link, which starts off by your obligations from the purpose and intended nature and are shifting to your ongoing monitoring obligations. How well do you know your client? What characteristics might trigger spikes or anomalies? So this should all feature in your protocols. Secondly, as part of your ongoing obligations, you should also ensure that any identity verification documents remain up to date and valid. In this regard, in terms of the shortcomings, we often notice that unfortunately, when we're presented with AML CFT policies or manual, ongoing monitoring is either neglected or not always featuring. So as you may understand, this would be of great concern because as set out also in regulation 7, subject persons must perform ongoing monitoring. And if the procedures are silent, it would be difficult for us to ascertain the compliance with this regulation. We also notice at times that as part of your ongoing monitoring protocol, different thresholds are being set. Now, there is no problem in setting thresholds in the sense that you identify the business and what limits should be tolerated before performing a review. However, something that is a bit problematic is that sometimes you notice extraordinarily high thresholds, which for the bulk of the transactions undertaken, for example, the majority of your activity will remain under the radar, so to speak. So here again, it's tying in well with the initial point we made under the BRA with respect to you consulting with your business structures. These same thresholds, which would trigger periodical reviews for your profiles, should emanate from that assessment performed for the business structures. And as officials, when we come on site and we see these thresholds, we need to understand these thresholds and how they were put together. And this would also help us to understand their effectiveness. All right, we can move to the next slide, please. So now we'll be looking at the relationships with politically exposed persons. So as you all know by now, a politically exposed person is inherently exposed to a higher risk of AML lefting in view of his prominent public function. In this regard, the regulation requires subject persons to apply enhanced due diligence measures when handling such relationships. And these measures, as outlined also in section 3.4 of the IP Part 2, include, for example, obtaining senior management approval, before establishing the relationship, determine the source of wealth and, where applicable, also the source of funds, and conduct enhanced ongoing monitoring. The key shortcoming in this result mainly relates to, we can start off by senior management approvals not being adequately documented and exhibited for evidence. Although we might obtain a verbal declaration saying that yes, this was discussed at high level, at levels in the company, this should be adequately documented as well. In terms of the due diligence measures applied, there are also instances where, despite being a politically exposed person and also risk rated as high risk as per your customer risk assessment, we still see normal due diligence, normal CDD being applied vis-a-vis these players. So it is an expectation that when reviewing such player profiles as part of the examination, we see the enhanced due diligence being carried out. This might relate also in terms of the extent of the source of wealth and source of fund documentation that you obtain for these players. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So the next topic for discussion is also the role of the MLRO. So as indicated in section 5.1.2 of the implementing procedures part 1, now there is no restriction in terms on the applicability of an officer acting as MLRO from having additional function within the subject person. However, due consideration must be given as to whether such additional positions may lead to conflicts of interest, which might, of course, hinder the performance of the MLRO function. In this regard, we wish to know that we do come across instances where the MLRO also directly holds other positions directly in business development, or else are also the ultimate beneficial owners, which clearly might pose a conflict of interest in this regard as well. Next slide, please. So, said that, these are the key takeaways from my end. It's empirical for you to take stock of your ML FT risks before you start or before keep conducting your business and maintaining your business relationships. The customer risk assessment is not a tick box exercise. It will help you to apply the commensurate due diligence measures. Please document the analysis performed for your business risk assessment, as this will allow you both to adequately perform this risk assessment, evidence it, and apply a consistent approach. Include all the risk pillars, apply proportionate CDD measures, duly monitor existing business relationships and gauge them against the knowledge you hold on them and the activity which is undertaken, and last but not least, own your AML CFT protocol. It should be bespoke to the business, to your business model. That is all from my end. Thank you.
Over to you now, Tracy.
Hi, Annika. Thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tracy Kauki. I am the AML manager at the Malta Gaming Authority, and I'll be taking you through the last part of our presentation today. I'll try my best to keep it brief, as I know that we're running slightly behind schedule. So, my first slide, Annika, please. So my presentation is going to focus on best practices. So I'll be answering some of your questions as to how operators and subject persons can improve throughout an examination process to ensure that the process is expeditious as much as possible and efficient. So my presentation is divided into according to the different stages of the presentation, starting off with the documentation submission stage. So when the FIU send the notice letter to the subject person, to the gaming company, they are obviously requested to provide a set of documents. Now, most of the time, we tend to be requested an extension, so operators would require some more time to provide this documentation. However, it is of utmost importance that this documentation is provided in a timely manner and therefore within 1 week from receipt of the notice letter. Reason being is primarily that we need to obviously adopt a fair approach with each and every operator. So I believe it would be unfair to afford another week for one operator but not the other. And apart from that, operators must understand that information and the documentation requested must be readily available upon demand. So it is about submitting the already available information and documentation. Now, the said documents also have to be submitted in a complete manner. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that operators cannot pick and choose which documents to submit. So all documents requested are equally important, and as rightfully mentioned before by my colleague Rudolf, if certain documents are not submitted, this would constitute obviously a finding. Now, another important point to mention is that ideally the documentation submitted would follow the same name, number, and order as set out in the FIU notification letter. So basically, ideally, the documentation is provided in a structured format, and this also applies throughout the examination. So when operators are requested to provide additional documents, ideally, for example, they are requested to provide certain documents or screenshots or transaction history of a player profile, of different player profiles. Ideally, these are clearly labeled in order to make it easy also for the examiners to sort out also the data and the information. The documents provided by the subject person also needs to be dated. I believe dates are fundamental. There are a number of requirements in the PML FTR and the IPs which specify that, for example, a business risk assessment needs to be updated every year. And therefore, dates are crucial because, first of all, through the dates, operators would be able to prove that, for example, a business risk assessment or the policies and procedures have been revised throughout time also to reflect different risks, to also reflect changes in legislation, etc. So it's important, ideally, the documents would have also a documentation history because policies and procedures, and in particular the BRA, should be a live document, and ideally, obviously, the authorities would understand the amendments carried out by the operators from time to time. Apart from that, it's a must that operators ensure that they submit the most recent and updated documentation. Why is this important? Because the documentation that is considered for examination purposes are the ones which are submitted within the first week, so within 1 week from receipt of the notice letter. So any documents which are submitted throughout the course of the examination, like for example, if the business risk assessment, if the operator provides a different business risk assessment throughout the examination, that would be considered as if it was amended after the deadline for the submission of the documentation. So it's important that the documents submitted upon receipt of the notice letter are the most updated documentation. Now, moving on to the next slide, please, Janika. So what can be done by subject persons prior to the actual on-site examination? So I think it's of utmost importance that they dedicate sufficient time to prepare for the examination. I believe AML audits should be taken very seriously, like previously mentioned by Rudolf. Non-compliance can result in hefty administrative fines, I have to say. So it's important that this is taken seriously by operators, and in order to do so, this requires time, and they need to prepare themselves fully for the examination by roping in all relevant employees. And this leads me to my second point. So notwithstanding that we direct the majority of our questions to the MLRO, ultimately the examination would be carried out on the subject person, on the gaming company. And therefore, it is important that all relevant employees would be available during the examination, because it could be that certain questions that other employees would be best placed to answer certain questions asked by obviously the examiners. And therefore, it's important that the subject person ensures that people, for example, within the IT department or HR department, because we sometimes also ask questions relative to training, for example, that they would make themselves available for any questions that may be asked by the examiners. Apart from that, it is of utmost importance that checks are carried out prior to the on-site examination, checks on the systems. What do I mean by this? I believe a lot of time tends to be lost due to, for example, malfunctioning or glitches in the system. And therefore, it's important that prior to an on-site examination, subject persons test their systems to ensure that they are fully functional and that they have the tools that they use, which are functioning, in order for them to be able to provide the necessary demonstrations to the examiners. Something worth mentioning on this is the fact that, as obviously you may know, the inspections are at the moment, due to the pandemic situation, are being carried out remotely. And also something worth mentioning is the fact that ideally, obviously, tests and checks are also carried out to ensure that the platforms that we use, that the representatives of the company have the microphones working, the cameras, that they are able to share their screen, for example, because obviously this would be fundamental, and it will have it will obviously impact the whole course of the examination. The more efficient the systems of the operators are, the more flowing the examination would be, I would say. On to the next slide. Now, what can be done to improve the on-site examination process? So primarily, the inspection entails questioning to the MLRO and also other representatives of the company, and also it also involves testing. Now, when it comes to interviewing, it is important that the interviewee, so the employees of the company, they listen carefully to the question and they seek clarification if they do not answer, if they do not understand the question fully. This is obviously important because sometimes the representatives tend to deviate from the subject a little, or otherwise answer the wrong question, the question wrongly. So it's important that if a question is not understood, obviously clarification is sought in order to avoid wasting time also in further questioning by obviously the examiners. Apart from that, the answers need to be ideally clear and concise as much as possible. So it's important that the interviewees do not deviate from the topic, because obviously this will unnecessarily prolong the process. So it's important that when a question is asked, the concise and clear answer is obviously provided. Another point worth mentioning is that contradictory responses by interviewees should be strictly avoided. There are times when, for example, during an inspection, a question is asked and different employees of the subject person start answering, and or else they would contradict themselves and thus create undue confusion. So it's important that, for example, the subject person designate an employee to answer the majority of the questions. Ideally, obviously, the MLRO, but we understand that the MLRO might be required to, might need to be assisted by other employees who would, for example, be best placed to obviously answer certain questions. But what's most important is that obviously people don't talk over one another, and that the person who would be answering the question would not be interrupted, because obviously when contradictory responses are made, this would have obviously a negative effect on the entire examination. Next slide, Yannicka, please. Now, I think this is very important to mention. While obviously under the PMLFTR and the implementing procedures, operators have the right to appoint consultants to assist them with, for example, the devising of the policies and procedures, the carrying out of the business risk assessment. However, during an examination, the examiners expect the majority of the answers to be answered by the MLRO and other representatives of the company. This is because we believe that the employees of the company know their systems and the procedures best. And apart from that, the main aim of an examination is to assist mostly the implementation of the policies and procedures of the company. So while obviously there is a requirement to have a set of policies and procedures, it is useless to have detailed policies and procedures unless these are implemented in practice. And that is exactly what we're after during an on-site examination. And it's also the reason why we believe that while consultants may be present, we have no issue with that, but the questions should be, are directed and should be answered by the MLRO, also with the assistance of his colleagues working within the company. Now, on to the next point. The onus to prove compliance with the AML CFT obligations lies with the operator, and I think this is very important. So the examiners are there to ask questions, to carry out testing, but it is ultimately in the interest of the operator to show, to demonstrate how it is complying with the AML CFT obligations. And therefore, just to give you an example, for example, the examiner may ask you, how do you carry out PEP screening? It is the operator who has to sort of demonstrate the systems and the tools that they use to ensure compliance with this requirement in particular. Okay. And my final point on the on-site examination is that operators must keep in mind that the on-site examination is a fact-finding exercise, not a consultancy session. What do I mean by this? It is important, and it is of utmost importance to be kept in mind that the officers present during an AML CFT examinations are, first of all, not legal advisors. So they should be the ones to make the questions, not vice versa. This is because ultimately the officers are there to ask questions and collect evidence based on, obviously, to test the level of compliance of the subject persons. However, the examiners are not the legislator, so they are not there to interpret the intention of the legislator. And I stress the importance of this. And also, as before mentioned, as previously mentioned by Janika, should you have any questions related to the IPs, for example, you can always direct your questions to the FIU at their email address, queries@fiumalta.org.mt. My next slide, Janika, please. Now, some tips for the MLRO. As we mentioned, many times throughout all the presentations, the MLRO is the most crucial, has the most crucial role during an on-site, during a full scope or a thematic or targeted examination. Why? This is because it is the MLRO, when it comes to AML CFT matters, who is the driver of AML compliance within the subject person. So whilst we obviously understand that each employee would have their different roles within the company, it is the MLRO who has to ensure that the different departments, while fulfilling their functions, that they are simultaneously, obviously, abiding by the AML CFT requirements and regulations. Now, here I'd like to make an important comment on the distinction made by the PML FTR and the IPs on the reporting functions and the monitoring functions. So the PML FTR and the IPs give subject person the possibility to appoint a different individual within the company, obviously, to carry out the monitoring functions. Now, in this case, so should the operator opt for this, the monitoring officer would be responsible for overseeing the implementation of the operator's AML CFT procedures on a day-to-day basis. However, and this is something very important to point out, the MLRO still retains responsibility vis-a-vis AML's CFT matters, and also to ensure, obviously, compliance with the requirements. This is because, for example, even though the monitoring officer would be overseeing the day-to-day activities of the subject person, it is ultimately the MLRO who is responsible in ensuring that, for example, the business risk assessment is updated on a yearly basis as a minimum. Or, for example, that the employees within the company receive adequate training regularly on AML. Now, to this end, obviously, in carrying out his functions, the MLRO would obviously require full access to the subject person's systems. So obviously, the MLRO, in order to be able to carry out his particularly the reporting functions, he would need to also have access to the systems of the operator, without, unlimited access to the CDD documentation of the customers, to the transactions of the customers, etc. This is also important if the subject person opts for outsourcing some of its AML CFT requirements to third parties, for example. So the MLRO still must have access to the systems, in the sense that any documentation which may be required has to be made ready by the outsourced company. Now, obviously, my last point here is saying that it is purely for the reasons that I mentioned before, the fact that the MLRO retains ultimate responsibility for all AML CFT matters, that it is the MLRO is expected to obviously take the lead in an AML CFT examination, obviously with the assistance of also his employees during the examination to assist him as well. Last slide, Janika, please. So I'm going to give you some key takeaways in relation to obviously the AML CFT examinations conducted by the MG and the FIU. So primarily, operators and subject persons should use examinations as a value-adding tool to your business. What do I mean by this? For those operators who would have heavily invested in systems and tools in order to ensure compliance with the regulations, I believe that an AML examination would be an opportunity for them to showcase all that they have been doing to basically ensure compliance with the requirements, and also in order to show that they are doing their utmost to mitigate any MLTF risks to the ultimate degree. For others, it can be an opportunity to learn from mistakes and also, for example, to understand what can be done to remediate. Now, cooperation and professionalism should be maintained throughout the whole course of an AML examination. We fully understand that an inspection can be cumbersome, it can be stressful at times. However, and I cannot stress this enough, the more cooperative the representatives of the company are, and the more efficient the information is provided, the more smooth and the more expeditious the examination process would be. My third key takeaway for you is, I would say, refrain from getting too defensive and instead demonstrate a proactive and receptive approach to feedback. I believe that when sometimes, especially this happens most in the wrap-up meeting, when the company, the subject person gets very defensive and sometimes challenge the officers, I think that may impact or reflect negatively on the company, because ultimately the operators have to keep in mind that during the inspection, what's necessary is that they show and demonstrate how they are effectively abiding by the regulations, and also to explain or to attend to any queries that the officers or the examiners may have. Finally, my last point, my last tip for you is vis-a-vis record keeping. Record keeping should not start when a notification for an AML examination is received, but should be a day-to-day priority. Obviously, unless data is retained, unless documents are maintained on file, I believe it would be close to impossible for the employees of the subject person and also the MLRO to be able to effectively carry out their duty. So the records should be retained not only to be able to satisfy sort of the authorities when an examination is conducted, but should be part of the process. Ultimately, record keeping is a requirement, it's an obligation, and therefore it is of utmost importance that data and the information is retained, particularly, for example, transactions, any data relative to the player, records of screening carried out, different versions of policies and procedures, etc. So record keeping is one of the ways in order to show and prove that the subject person is on the side, obviously, of compliance. Thank you for your time. I will now hand you back to Janika.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Thank you, Rudolf, and thank you, Kurt. We've run out of time, unfortunately. However, we have done our best to reply to a number of questions in the chat. In any case, I've handpicked 3 questions, one for each of the speakers, and that leads me to my first question. I remind you that should you have any other questions, please utilize the FIAU and the MGA. You may contact us through the contact form on our website and also on queries@fiaumalta.org. Okay, so Kurt, this question is for you. A participant has asked whether, in terms of the quantitative data that you've made reference to in the BRA, whether you're expecting subject persons to include these explicitly in the business risk assessment or else in any other ancillary documents.
All right. So thanks for that. In terms of, can you hear me? All right. All right. So in terms of where to incorporate the quantitative data, per se, it doesn't have to be explicitly included within the DRA. What we're after, so as a short response, it can be included in ancillary documentation. Nonetheless, it is very important for you to carry this out, conduct a quantitative analysis, and also demonstrate this, as it will help us to understand the rationality behind the business risk assessments and also the results of that. So I think that's my answer here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kurt. Tracy, are operators required to provide translations of documents in a foreign language to the MGA and FIU officers during an AML audit? And if yes, does it have to be a literal one?
So, very good question, I have to say. So first of all, let me talk a bit about the obligation of interpreting and translating documents. So according to the implementing procedures, and now I think it has become quite clear with the revised IPs, whenever, unless the majority of the employees of the subject person understand a foreign language, German, Russian, Greek, whatever, they would need to translate the document. So a document which is provided in a foreign language would need to be translated in order also for other employees within the company, particularly the MLRO, to be able to obviously understand its contents. So essentially the requirement is to translate and interpret documents whenever the language is not understood by the majority of the employees working for the company. Now, as regards any translations or interpretations requested by the MG and FIU, I believe this is a must because obviously, so let's say, just to put people into perspective, let's say you have a company which targets Greece, for example, and the majority of the employees are Greek, for example. In order for the MGA or the FIU to be able to carry out its assessment effectively, they obviously would require an interpretation of the document at hand. Now, back to regarding the second question, when we're asking, when the officers would ask for a translated or interpretation of a document, we are not after a literal translation in the sense that a document would not need to be translated word for word. What we require is the salient points. Meaning that, for example, just to give an example, let's say, for example, the operator requests a source of wealth document and they receive a contract of sale in German, for example, and the MGA or the FI officers request an interpretation of the document. What we would need is an explanation of the most important points. For example, the proceeds and the amounts the vendor would have acquired from such transaction, etc. So it doesn't have to be literally a word-for-word translation.
Excellent, thank you very much. Rudolf, I thought maybe you could answer this question. What should we expect from wrap-up meetings? Should we expect some feedback in writing at that stage on specific matters?
Thank you, Annika. Yes, in relation to the wrap-up meetings, as we had previously mentioned, basically keep in mind that it marks the end of the supervisory examination. Keep in mind that the information that will be shared at that point will be the preliminary findings, so they will be taken from a high-level perspective without usually getting into too much of the details, because as I said, the consolidation of data, etc., is still ongoing even after the wrap-up stage. And no, immediately after the wrap-up, one should not expect the findings in writing. That's because there will be the final report, which will follow within a few months, basically. We would expect it to take 4 months, but the outcome of the wrap-up is not followed immediately by a written report, but it will be examination report after a couple of months that will be issued. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much. So that brings us to the end
of today's webinar. I just wanted to thank everyone once again for your time, for finding the time to tune in. Apologies for taking 15 minutes longer than we had planned. But thank you for those that stayed, and we really hope that you found today's webinar insightful and also useful. Please use this knowledge and implement it. Only then can we hope to continue to elevate the level of AML CFT supervision in Malta. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a good afternoon and a happy weekend.